to Issues Today, Greek edition. So, right now, I'm at the Greece airport. I've just landed for my research on nothing other than, you guessed it, the Greek debt crisis. In this segment, we'll be meeting all kinds of special economic specialists, students of master's degrees who are specializing in the Greek debt crisis, and all kinds of other experts and people who know everything you need to know about the Greek debt crisis. So, what research have I already gathered that I can present to you right now? The Greek debt crisis started right after the 2008 recession. Greece joined the European Union in 1981, but adopted the euro as their currency 20 years later, in 2001. The European Union created a central bank for all the Eurozone countries in 1998. After joining the EU, Greece started to borrow large amounts of money because the interest rate was quite low, approximately 1.98%. Greece had borrowed so much more money than they generated in revenue with their taxes. This caused them to fall in huge debt, obviously. The borrowing eventually stopped after the US housing market collapsed. Greece could no longer borrow money or pay back their creditors since they had no money. Greece had to ask the European Central Bank and the European Union for financial assistance. Greece got 3 bailouts that were worth around 310 billion euros, so that's about $360 billion USD. On August 20th, 2018, Greece finally decided to withdraw from the bailouts, meaning that they would not acquire any money from the EU, ECB, or the International Monetary Fund, referred to as IMF. This financial crisis affected many people in Greece, such as firms, markets, stakeholders, and of course, the people of Greece. We're now going to meet Mr. Poseidon, our economics expert, specifically on firms, markets, and that kind of thing. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's go in. Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you.
I'm Mr. Poseidon.
I am Miss Persephone.
Well, come on in. Let's have it.
Yes, let's get started. Thank you for meeting with me, Sir Poseidon.
Oh, no problem.
I know your expertise is, of course, in economics and the Greek debt crisis, but I know you specialize particularly in the kind of section of firms, markets, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as you know, I'm doing some research on this topic and was wondering if you could just answer a few questions for
Sure,
me.
go right ahead.
All right, so my first question is, as we know, the Greek debt crisis is the dangerous amount of sovereign debt Greece owed the European Union between 2008 and 2018,
yes.
so yeah, for the past 10 years.
Yeah.
What are the firms directly involved in the crisis?
Well, there are 6 main firms who have loaned Greece in the year span from 2008 to 2018. So the 6 main ones are the European Financial Stability Mechanism and European Stability Mechanism, which is 168 billion euros. And then the second one is the Eurozone government, which was 53 billion euros. Then there was the private investors who donated 34 billion euros. And the Greek government bondholders who donated 15 billion euros. The 5th one is the ECB, or the European Central Bank, which donated 13 billion euros, and then the IMF, who donated 12 billion euros. So that's a lot of money.
Yeah, more than I can ever make in my lifetime.
Yeah.
What did Greece initially try to do, and which firm reacted first for the crisis?
Well, when they got into their financial crisis in 2008, they initially tried to obtain default on their debt, so they're trying to get excused for a lot of the debt because they couldn't pay back. So, however, the EU was not happy with that, so the EU loaned Greece enough to make payments over the years. So the biggest lenders that helped with that in the EU was Germany and their bankers in Germany. They demanded austerity measures, and they believed that the measures would improve Greece's comparative advantage in the global marketplace. The austerity measures required Greece to improve how it managed public finances. This made them modernize its financial statistics and reporting, and it lowered trade barriers and increased exports.
Interesting. So how come the austerity measures did not work for a long period of time? Like, what happened there?
Well, the austerity measures forced the Greek government to cut spending and increase taxes. So this cost 72 billion euros of 40% of the GDP. So as a result of that, the Greek economy shrank up to like 25%. That reduced the tax revenue needed to repay the debt, and employment rose to 25% from the 9%. and while youth employment hit 50%, rioting then broke out in the streets as many were upset with all that was going on, and the political system was in chaos, and voters were just looking for any painless way out of this
Yeah.
crisis.
Undoubtedly. You mentioned the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So what impact did they have on the issue?
Well, the EU and the IMF provided 240 billion euros in emergency funds in return for austerity measures. So the loan gave Greece enough money to pay interest on its existing debt and keep banks capitalized. The EU had no choice to stand behind its member by funding a bailout. Otherwise, it would face the consequences of Greece either leaving the eurozone or trying to default. The IMF, however, pushed the Greek government to implement pension and tax reforms and pushing European creditors to grant debt relief to Greece. However, some analysts and other economics criticized the IMF's involvement in Greece, particularly extending large loans when questions surrounding the stability of Greece's debt, because obviously we know like the austerity measures weren't really helping up until now. Other analysts argue that the IMF program in Greece were critical for stemming contagion and ensuring stability in the global economy.
Moving on, I know there are different types of market structures in any given economy, like perfect competition, monopolistic competition. You got the idea. You're the expert
Yes.
here. So, what type of market is Greece running? Like, if you had to narrow it down into a main one?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. So Greece's market structure can be categorized as an oligopolistic due to the competition in many industry sectors such as tourism, imports and export sectors, stuff like that. The nature of the market in Greece has changed drastically due to many challenges such as lack of market liquidity, the necessities of supplier flexibility on payment terms, and seller financing solutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Has the market improved in recent times? Because the issue has been going on for a decade now. What are some of the main obstacles that get in the way from fixing or at least improving the issue?
Well, yeah, you're right. The issue has been going on for like 10 years now, from 2008 2018, which is really long. But the market has contracted severely since 2008's financial crisis, and like I said, it still has yet to recover. Unemployment rate is still pretty high at 19%, but since 2008 has gone down from the 25% it was. This plays as one of the biggest factors in the change of the Greek market. The market structure has worsened with the imposition of capital control in June 2015 and has slowly improved then, so it's only been 3 years, but slowly improving. One of the major factors opposing as to why the nature of the market has changed for the worse is because of how Greece is run. Greece laws protect property rights, but they're not strongly enforced, so that plays an issue. But enforcement of contracts have improved over the years. Greek has judiciary independence, but the court system is sometimes inefficient. Corruption remains a problem, and officials in recent times, authorities have largely failed to stop tax evasion, putting a major impact on the market. The market nature overall has been severely undermined by the crisis, and the Greek economy remains under significant problems, making Greece market's nature change over time.
We're back for a second day of discussions with Poseidon, our firms and markets expert. Again, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me for a second day.
Oh, no problem. It's my pleasure.
All right, so I actually just had one more question for you.
Go for it.
Does the nature of the firms, of the markets, actually play a role in the issue in any way?
Oh, yeah, certainly. So the Greek debt crisis is based upon 5 main causes, which are poor GDP growth, government debt, government deficit, budget compliances, and data credibility. So starting off with GDP, which means gross domestic product, it does have a role within the Greek debt crisis, as everything that's being exported out of Greece has to do with the nature of the market, and how I mentioned before, the nature of the market has an oligopolistic market, meaning only a few firms dominate the market economy of Greece. So for example, the public sector share of GDP now exceeds 40% of what originally it used to. Another issue the market faces is the EU is trying to become a single market. While this is not a major issue for Greece, as they're in the EU, it is for the US, who heavily trade with the EU countries such as France, Italy, and the United Kingdom. So the US exporters in some sectors continue to face some barriers to enter and other challenges in several industries such as pharmaceutical, telecommunications, legal services, government procurements. Some of these barriers are pronounced in some member states. One of the EU legislation's forms they take are directives. Directives are something that which provide general framework and must be exchanged within the national legislation at the member state level. So the difference in how directives are exchanged in Greece and other member complicates for the US when they trade with the other EU countries. So industries have periodically raised concerns over perceived regulations and high compliances costs. So this just further shows that the nature of the market does play a role in the government and in the issue.
Thank you so much for all your help and your opinion. This was very insightful, and thank you. It really taught me a lot. Like I really didn't know any of this.
Oh, I'm happy to share all the information I know. It's what I have a degree in.
Awesome. So thank you once again.
Okay.
And hope you guys have learned a bit more about the market and firms aspect of this issue. So the two are very clearly directly related.
Yes.
Okay, wow. It really shows how everything in the economy just connects with one another. It's not like everything is separate and might share a common thing or two. No. Wow.
Yeah.
To understand the economic trade-offs aspect of the Greek debt crisis, I spoke with Julius Caesar, who was actually part of the Greek government back in 2015 before the cabinet reshuffle and the September elections. From our conversation, I got to learn more about the stakeholders, the sacrifices people had to make, so the stakes at hand, and of course, trade-offs, decisions, and just so much incredible information about the crisis that is definitely worth knowing. Who are the different stakeholders in this issue? Tell me about consumer groups, producers, and the government.
So one of the main stakeholders includes the Greek government. The Greek government was the main reason why the crisis even took place. Their borrowing of the large amounts of money led them to fall into an enormous amount of debt. The Greek government was affected by the crisis because they had a lot of pressure to reduce their amount of debt. The government was not receiving any revenue from the public, which made it harder to pay off the debt. The crisis has more effect on the stakeholders than the government itself. The next stakeholders were the Eurozone countries. The Eurozone countries are directly affected by the crisis. Since a lot of the Eurozone countries were in debt, Germany and France struggled to help them all. Germany gave billions of euros to Greece. Having many countries in debt made it very hard for the Eurozone countries to stay stable overall. The next stakeholders affected were the Greek public. Due to the government's decision to raise taxes, the public had to pay a lot of the money directed towards the taxes. They're already living in such poor living conditions, which the higher taxes made them even worse. To add on to this horrible situation, Greeks were losing a lot of jobs. During the crisis, Greece suffered a 25% unemployment rate and a youth unemployment rate of 50%. Pension cuts were also made because Greece was not part of the bailout program and is not getting any financial aid. The new way of making more revenue as well as making the taxes higher. So the last set of stakeholders affected was the global market. Internationally, there were many countries that struggled to stay stable. Greece and Europe were one of the major exporters of the global economy. Greece was not able to produce much during the crisis, and not many products were being exported, which made the exports decrease from Greece overall, and they were not able to export to countries such as Canada, US, and India.
So clearly a lot of people were affected by the crisis. It wasn't just a particular group or certain individuals. Okay. What decisions are they faced with, and what trade-offs are they making?
Greece was faced with many decisions with the trade-offs and which trade-offs they were making. Analysts argue that Greece exiting the Eurozone and adopting their own national currency could provide the government with greater autonomy and flexibility for responding to the crisis. Secondly, if Greece exits the Eurozone and restrained the drachma, Greece would have converted euro-based debt into drachmas, printed more currency, and lowered its euro exchange rates. And that would have reduced its debt, lowered the cost of exports, and attracted tourists to a cheaper vacation destination. But also adding on to that, the foreign owners of the Greek debt would have suffered debilitating losses such as the drachma plummeted. That would lower the value of the repayments in their own currency. Some banks would go bankrupt. Most of the debt is owned by European governments whose taxpayers would pay the bill. So many companies refuse to export these items to a country that may not be able to pay its own bills. The country couldn't attract new foreign investment such as unstable situations. The only countries that would lend to Greece are China and Russia. In the long run, Greece would find itself back where it began, burdened in debt and the debt it couldn't repay. Continuing on with that, on August 20th, 2018, the bailout program ended. Most of the outstanding debt is owed to the EU emergency funding entries, the primarily funded by the German banks. Until the debt is repaid, European creditors will informally supervise adherence to existing austerity measures. The deal means that no new measures will be created at all.
Interesting. Are there any non-monetary, social, or third-party costs associated with the Greek debt crisis?
Well, it's difficult not to mention any money and a monetary issue, but yes, the debt crisis did take a toll on Greeks economically, socially, and politically. Youth unemployment has reached 50% in 2011. Now it has gone down to 43.6% and is bound to fall to 14% by 2023.
At least there has been a little improvement, and the future outlook is positive.
The current rates are still the worst in the EU, and projected rate is worse than the Eurozone's current youth unemployment rate of 8.3%. During the crisis, unemployment peaked at 20%. These are the rates that we saw during the Great Depression.
There were clearly economic, non-monetary impacts. What were some of the political impacts?
So during the bailout discussions, Grexit became a major issue. One of the nations that were participating in the discussions, 9 referred Grexit. Greece also experienced 4 governments during the bailout session, so there was a certain extent of instability. Needlessly to say, they suffered from one of the worst recessions in economic history. Troika, which you may have heard about, resulted in quite a loss of Greece's fiscal serenity, as these are monetary organizations became good as watchdogs to the Greek government.
There were some issues within the Greek government during discussions of the third bailout. Could you expand upon that?
So while the Eurozone leaders were discussing the agreements of the third-party bailout, the party Syriza, who I remind you was in power of Greece at that time, was showing signs of disintegration. Party leaders described the demands of reform as utter blackmail. The shuffle meant removing the ministers who have refused to vote for the austerity package in the parliament.
So it was almost as if they were trying to get rid of the opposition?
So exactly to put this into perspective for you, all these discussions were on a Saturday. To reform had to be done by Wednesday, the cabinet reshuffle had to be done by the next Saturday, and you would see the reorganized cabinet on the following Monday.
What were the end results?
So 17 MP ranks, which stripped the president of his government's working majority. 15 lawmakers indicated did not approve of the agreement entirely. The resistance raised the threat of Tsipras being forced for another election and a catastrophic move for the country. There was another election, September 2015, just 9 months later of the previous election, but the results virtually unchanged. The Syriza party came in power again. They did not hold the majority, but still had the greatest number of seats, which was 145, to be exact.
So it wasn't like an election at all. It was just a complicated cabinet reshuffle. What about social impacts?
So after the wages were cut and pensions slashed in the first bailout, there was a drastic increase in male suicide. 551 males, specifically between the age of 45 and 89, killed themselves between 2009 and 2010 because of the extreme budget cuts, and the poverty increased. 1 in 5 Greeks were at extreme risks of poverty and social deprivation in 2015. The population also fell by 3% in the first bailout, and due to lower birth rates and immigrations, healthcare faced huge budget cuts, which led in a rise of HIV infections by 200% in 2011 due to the high budget cuts and prevention. Interestingly, though, Greece experimented their first malaria outbreak in over decades. Overall, people were physically and mentally unhealthier. The economic struggles took on a toll of people's personal lives and affected a lot of things majorly.
All right, thank you so much for your input and knowledge on this topic. I know I definitely learned so much about this. Thank you once again. Have a great day. Bye. To understand the role of the Greek government and international governments in the Greek debt crisis, I reached out to Athena, a student who specialized in economics at the University of Athens. Unfortunately, she was unavailable for a face-to-face interview, but she sent me a video with all the answers to the questions I had for her.
Hello, I'm so sorry I was not able to meet up with you because of my busy schedule, but I made sure to answer all of your questions in this video. So let's start off with the first question. What is the main source of revenue for the Greek government? Did they use taxation? Yes, the Greek government did use taxation during the Greek debt crisis. Taxes are one of the main sources of revenue for any country, but that's exactly what Greece was not collecting. Before the crisis, Greece was barely taking any revenue from the public, so they weren't making as much revenue. In 2010, the austerity measures that Greece agreed to in order to receive the bailouts actually forced them to raise their taxes. During the crisis, the economic growth was actually in the negative, sitting at negative 7.3%, but they had an incline in the economic growth after they implemented the high taxes. Greece started receiving a lot of revenue from sales tax as well as tourism. It is said that approximately 32 million people will enter the country this year. And like normal people, those tourists also need to buy necessities, so they will be paying the value-added tax, which is approximately 24%, so that's helping the Greek economy. Along with the value-added tax, the tourists also need to pay an overnight stay tax. So for every night they spend in a hotel, they need to pay up to €4 every time they check in. So overall, taxation provided Greece with a lot of money to repay the debt, but the Greek people were not happy with the decision of high taxes. Did the government spend a lot of money during the crisis? So taxes finance government spending. So if there's an increase in government spending, that means that there was an increase in taxes. So during the crisis, the government spent a lot of money on interest that was on outstanding debt. So during the crisis, the government spending was about 40% of the GDP, but after earning bailouts from the EU, the government spending started increasing in 2010, reaching its high in 2013 at 62.3% of the GDP. The taxes earned from the public all went towards repaying the debt. Out of all of the money earned from the taxes and the bailouts, the government used 90% of it to repay the debt, and only less than 10% was for the Greek people and the welfare system. What about the markets? How are they regulating competition? So the Greek economy continues to rely heavily on large-sized businesses. By their very nature, these businesses are much less competitive than their counterparts, which in turn affects the overall competitiveness of the Greek economy. Further hampering competitiveness are overregulation and bureaucracy in many different sectors. Are the markets efficient? So no, the Greek markets are not efficient. Certain tax laws and administrative processes contribute to the inefficiency and lower productivity, as do labor laws, which creates disincentives for larger enterprises to scale up and hire more employees. The labor market, despite recent reforms, continues to be relatively inefficient. Unions continue to heavily influence the economy, and generally inflexible labor requirements mean that companies are reticent to hire more workers. These inefficiencies make it extremely difficult to hire and to fire, and as a result, Greece has the lowest employment turnover rate in Europe and the longest average tenure in employment across the Union. Was the Greek welfare state affected by the crisis? Did they address the issue, or does it fall as well with the economy? Okay, so the Greek welfare state actually fell along with the economy. They were not providing services to the citizens, so they basically became useless. Experts stated that the Greek welfare state needed to reform to provide help to the most vulnerable people in the country. Because of the constant insufficiency of money, the welfare could only provide so much to the suffering Greeks. Before the crisis, the welfare state used to provide services as education, healthcare, pensions, benefits to the unemployed, and also disability and family benefits. The welfare state used to consume up to 30% of the budget per year. But after the crisis, since the whole economy shrank by 25%, that led to the lack of social services and welfare for the citizens. Many people lost their jobs, and it was seen that there was no spending on education or healthcare systems. All of these are factors that the Greek welfare system is in charge of, so if they aren't able to control it and provide any service, that means that they're losing their purpose. The major shock to the citizens was that the 45% of the pension was being cut out of the original amount. So Greek pensioners were losing about 350 euros monthly. Overall, so the welfare state was affected a lot by the crisis because it was barely helping the citizens. How did governments internationally intervene in the economy to help address the economic imbalances caused by the crisis? If I were to break it down in very little detail, I would be sitting here all day talking about it. Overall, it was very complicated and tedious. So much of the international aid was monetary aid provided by the three main organizations, also known as the Troika. Nations in the European Union played a major role in the negotiation process as the issue mainly affected Europe. So a North American nation like Canada did not need to step in and intervene. Anyways, the European nations discussed Greece's status in the EU and bailout agreements. They were key players in these aspects as most of the creditors were European monetary organizations such as the European Commission and European Central Bank. All of these are entities of the European Union, so the nations in the EU had to participate in creating the legislation and terms for the bailout. What happened during the bailouts, especially the third bailout that occurred in July 2015? So European leaders gave the Greek government a package of austerity measures that basically made them surrender their fiscal sovereignty to avoid being kicked out of the single block currency or to collapse financially. Being kicked out of the single block currency would mean that Greece would no longer be part of the euro. In the third bailout, to receive the 36 billion offered, the Greek government had to endorse the entire package by introducing new pieces of legislation in pensions and value-added tax, so like your GST. What Merkel had wanted to include in the ultimatum was for Greece to leave the euro for about 5 years if they disagreed with the terms of the new bailout. In the event of agreement, Greece would have had set aside 50 billion worth of collaterals to receive the new loans. Obviously, neither of these terms found a consensus. What changes did leaders say had to be made to the Greek legislation? So experts from Troika of creditors, which consisted of the IMF, European Commission and the European Central Bank, had to be in Athens to monitor the bailout program. The Troika would have a say in all relevant Greek legislation before it was presented to the parliament. All legislation passed by the left-wing Syriza government that year had to be amended if it did not agree with the creditors. And there was also some discussion about shuffling the cabinet around. What exactly was each Eurozone nation's perspective on these agreements? Majority of the European Union wanted to avoid Grexit. The main players, France and Germany, had opposite views on the issue. France wanted to reach an agreement for the third bailout while Germany did not want an agreement at any cost. Luxembourg was for the agreement. Its foreign affairs minister at the time, Jean Asselborn, commented that Germany had held a great responsibility and that if a Grexit happened, it would trigger conflict with France and the end result would be catastrophic for Europe. How did the negotiations play out in the end? What was in the agreement? In the end, the Greek parliament agreed to the new austerity measures because they were being offered 86 billion euros, which is quite an amount. For the money, they implemented tax reforms, cut public spending, privatized state assets, and reformed labor laws. Greek households now bring home 2/3 of the income they used to earn. It's important to note that the International Monetary Fund did not contribute to this bailout due to Greece's failure to pay back a loan in 2015. Greece saw high poverty and unemployment rates, but they have had improvement from 2011.
Despite the difficulties in reaching an agreement that benefited all the stakeholders, if it weren't for foreign aid, Greece would still be deep in their debt crisis with almost no hopes of improvement and their economy getting back on track. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes Greece to pay the debts that came from trying to get their economy back on track and how they handle loans and their finances in the future. The government and people of Greece have finally started seeing some light at the end of a dark tunnel. In August 2018, Greece received its final bailout package of 15 billion euros for 2 months. After that, it will receive a significant relief package of a 10-year extension on loans that were granted during previous bailouts and a 10-year deferral on interests and amortization. It now owes the EU and IMF about 290 billion euros, and I thought my mortgage payments were bad. To finance the debt, Greece has committed to a budget surplus through 2060 and accepted EU supervision. They must also follow additional austerity measures. However, they are on the path to reducing debts and getting their economy back on track. EU officials also claim the bailout is a success, which they were. Job creation has been steady and their unemployment rates are finally under 20%. It's still the highest among any other nation in the EU, but it's still better than 46% per se. If you look at the last 3 years, there has been a lot of growth in the economy. Now, when you compare Greece's situation in 2010 to their situation in 2019, you think you're looking into different galaxies. The future looks fairly positive. It surely was a bumpy ride, but everyone is optimistic. Here's to hoping that Greece's bank accounts are never again as frozen as this snow.